reacting to external demands or instruction rather than in ways determined by his own interests and energies and power. He says we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. For Humboldt, then, man is born to inquire and create. And when a man or a child chooses to inquire or create out of his own free choice, then he becomes in his own terms an artist rather than a tool of production or a well-trained parent.
Hello, and welcome to the 30th episode of the Diet Soap Podcast. This week's episode is entitled very simply, A New Logic? And you might notice that my voice goes up in a question there. It's Wednesday, November 4th, 2006, as I'm putting this together. And, as always, I'm Douglas Lane, the editor of the zine Diet Soap, and the host of this podcast. The guest this week is KMO of the Sea Realm, and KMO is probably well known to all of you who are listening, but he's been on the podcast before, and his podcast, The Sea Realm, was very much a part of the inspiration for Diet Soap, and I was glad to talk to him again. And I'll be reading a few emails at the end of the podcast. For now, let's just move ahead. You'll be hearing a conversation with KMO of the Sea Realm podcast right after Isto sings.
Fairy tales will come true. It can happen to you if you're young at heart. For it's hard, you will find, to be narrow of mind if you're young at heart. You will go to extremes with impossible schemes. You can laugh as your dreams fall apart at the seams, and life gets more exciting with each passing day, and love is either in your heart or on its way. Don't you know that it's worth every treasure on earth to be young at heart? For as rich as you are, it's much better by far to be young at heart. And if you should survive to 105, look at all you'll derive out of being alive. And here is the best part, you have a head start if you are among the very young at heart. Doo-ba-doo, doo-ba-doo, doo-ba-doo-ba-doo, doo-ba-doo. Don't you know that it's worth every treasure on earth to be young at heart? For as rich as you are, it's much better by far to be young at heart. And if you should survive to 105, look at all you'll derive out of being alive. And here is the best part, you have a head start if you are among the very young at heart.
KMO is a broadcaster and interviewer who has a gentle and amiable way of challenging and inspiring interesting conversations with authors, artists, psychedelic gurus, sociologists, NASA scientists, economists, and more on his weekly podcast called The Sea Realm. KMO is the only guest for Diet Soap who's been on the show more than once or been recorded more than once. And his Sea Realm podcast is something that I listen to every week, and which is largely inspired this podcast, but also inspires me to try to respond to what he's saying and the guests that he has on his show. And it's always good to have a chance to talk to him in a literal conversation. So, KMO, welcome to Diet Soap.
Oh, good to be back.
Last night you sent me a conversation an interview you'd had with Frank Roddering, who is an economist, someone who wants to develop an alternative logic than the capitalist logic that we're living under now. And I listened to that podcast, the rough cut of that last night, and I think that by the time this goes out, that will have been on the Sea Realm. I wanted to kind of talk to you about the subjects you talked about with him, largely also because when you were on the show before, we didn't really talk about some of the things that we might have, or that we thought we would, and that would be...
Or that we had promised the Sea Realm audience that we would talk about.
That's right. We were going to talk about the possibility of change, real change in this country and in the world, and basically the need for agitation and resistance to the current social political order. And that was something that we didn't discuss. So I thought I'd just throw it to you and let you start by saying what your impressions were of your interview with Frank Rotering, and we could take it from there.
Well, I like what he has to say, obviously, because I had him on the show, and his appearance on the show came from a suggestion from a Sea Realm listener. And Frank has got some YouTube videos which are basically PowerPoint presentations. You know, he's got slides and he's narrating over them. And I was looking at the download statistics, and you know, you might have 100 or 200 downloads for any given video, and two drunk girls kissing at a party can get 600,000 downloads. So, you know, I thought this is something that needs a little boost and deserves a little boost. So I asked him on the show, and a lot of what he had to say really seemed to validate what I was doing, and that he said that it's not really important that we make the overall message accessible or palatable to a general audience, that it's okay to be sort of a little cabal of people working on something really esoteric and, you know, putting it out to a small but informed audience, which is pretty much what I do. But at the same time, and this is, I think, where he and I diverged and things got a little tense, was in he thinks that we are in for what I call a Malthusian correction, or a dieback, but he made a point of saying that he doesn't use the term dieback, and I don't know what significance, you know, his not using the term has. But when I asked him if he thought it was likely, or, you know, what a timescale was, or basically he didn't want to engage in that topic. He thought, you know, that's not really relevant to what I'm doing. And recently, Albert Bates had sent me a blog entry from John Michael Greer, and it was called A Great Ambivalence. And it was basically, he was making reference to a conversation, a sort of print debate between two British journalists, and they're both, you know, largely on the same page in that what we have now is not sustainable, it will not continue. One of them was saying, well, basically one of the interlocutors was accusing the other of not taking the possibility of a dieback seriously, or not giving it the sort of emotional credence and weight that it deserves, or, you know, really failing to engage with the implications of the idea that when our society does start to unravel, that, you know, 6.5, 7 billion people are not going to continue living on this planet. And that was sort of my reaction to Frank. You know, he was saying, I've got this esoteric system that I'm working on. I'd like to get some other people here to, you know, to put it together, and we don't really have to worry about the larger currents of society. And really the whole notion of a dieback, when it might happen, how extensive it might be, you know, what might trigger it, is not all that relevant to my thinking. And it's sort of struck me as absurd on a grand scale that something like that would not be relevant to anybody's agenda or thoughts or concerns. And that's my reaction now.
Yeah, well, having listened to it, it did seem to me that he said that the alternative logic to capitalism that he was developing would ameliorate the Malthusian correction. Now, he didn't say how, but he did sort of indicate that part of what he was attempting to do would be setting up a more humane system that would protect more people from the dieback. And I would point out that it always strikes me there's two different possible outcomes here with biological overshoot. One is that we have a dramatic die-off where people don't live out their full life expectancy. And the other is that we have a dramatic decline in the birth rate. You know, kind of a rational adjustment in the birth rate. That's another alternative, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. It depends. Can the Earth sustain 6.5 billion people, even if they're not reproducing at all, for the rest of what we consider to be their natural lives? Particularly if the systems for growing food using intensive chemical and mechanical inputs and then distributing it over great distances breaks down. To Frank, I posed two previous C-Realm guests as sort of ends of a continuum or a spectrum. At one end, I pointed to my interview with Colin Tudge, who's a British science journalist, and he's written a book called Feeding People is Easy. And he basically takes the position that if we understand how the soil works and if we distribute that knowledge and get more people actually using human ingenuity and muscle power to raise food locally, that we can, in fact, feed 6.5 billion people without petrochemical mechanical agriculture. And then on the other end of that spectrum, we've got Derek Jensen, who says, no, we've totally violated the natural limits of the Earth and we have gone well beyond the carrying capacity. And in fact, there is going to be an inevitable crash, and it's going to be ugly, and it's actually going to lower the human population to below the previous carrying capacity of the planet. And Frank explicitly, identified with the Derek Jensen end of that spectrum. Mm-hmm. And, he thinks that, a crash in population, although he, insists that he doesn't use this terminology or doesn't really talk about it, is in the offing, and that the alternative system to capitalism that he's working out, is something that will provide a better life for a greatly diminished global population.
Right. Well, we can basically all agree that the need for a lower population level is there. That the Earth can't sustain this many humans. That's just obvious. But it seems to me that the human lifespan is actually fairly short. I mean, I hate saying that, being a human. I don't like looking at that, but it's true. So, and a good many of the people on the Earth are well into their natural lives.
Most of them are on the younger end, though. If the population doubles every few years, most of the people on the Earth are going to be pretty young.
The real problem here is how do we change our social structure so that people can cooperatively survive, rather than it being a very repressive, draconian, violent world, the one we're in now, where basically it's the people who've had the least responsibility for the problems who are bearing the most of the brunt of the impact. That's what I'm most interested in. And in a way, I'm with Richard in saying, until we solve that, the problem of how bad the die-off will be is one that isn't really worth examining. We're not in a position to do anything about it rationally until we have an alternative logic to the capitalist logic we're in now. I mean, I would agree with him on that. As whether or not he has the capitalist logic, the alternative to capitalism, I can't say. I haven't really looked at it, but
I can understand, where you're coming from, I think. But at the same time, the specifics of how long we can continue on our current course, without... there's a guest I've had on the program a couple times, Albert Bartlett. Albert Bartlett has a presentation that he's given many times. He calls it the exponential function, and he's talking about doubling of population growth or, doubling of anything. And one point that he makes is that human population growth will reach zero one way or another. It's going to happen. We can do it consciously, or we can just let circumstances dictate how it's done.
Well,
and what Frank...
I was going to say, one of the things that's interesting about a capitalist market-driven economy is that it supposedly is an irrational system of distribution. It's one which has its own natural self-correcting mechanisms, so that you don't have to plan or try to implement any levers of control. That's the free market approach. So if we leave it to the system of capitalism to deal with it, that approach will be basically leaving it to its own devices, continuing on this path and not having any kind of rational response, but just hoping that the systems we have in place will self-correct. So that, again, we need an alternative to the capitalist logic in order to have a chance to rationally respond.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just don't have a lot of enthusiasm for coming up with abstract systems that very few people are going to understand. I mean, if it's perfectly fine to come up with some new economic model, but until you can figure out a way to implement it and to get people who don't understand it to participate in it, then it's kind of like string theory, or it's kind of like some abstruse mathematical theory. You can come up with some alternative version of mathematics or some alternative logic, but if it doesn't answer to the intuitive way that people go about getting around in the world, then I don't see how it's going to do anybody any good, really. But I'd like to introduce two sort of jargony terms, and this is something that people who read like the works of Thomas Homer Dixon or Peter Ward are going to recognize, and it's negative feedbacks and positive feedbacks. And negative feedbacks are like in what we have in our constitutional arrangement here in the United States, the checks and balances, feedbacks that keep other processes from running away and getting out of control. And then you've got positive feedbacks, and positive feedbacks are things that feed back into themselves to make the original process even more pronounced. For example, if you've got global warming going on, then the permafrost up north starts to melt and all the organic matter in it decays, and as it does, it releases methane, which is a greenhouse gas, which exacerbates the warming. And, melts the polar ice caps, which, are white and reflect sunlight into the, off of the earth. And as that melts and shrinks, you've got more dark water there, which absorbs the light coming in and the heat, which accelerates global warming. So these are the types of positive feedbacks that can really get us into trouble. And ungoverned capitalism, I think, is replete with these sorts of positive feedbacks which lead to these boom and bust cycles, and that the attempts at intelligent management of free market capitalism yields the sort of governed capitalism that we have now, whereby we have things like the Federal Reserve, which can tinker with interest rates and whatnot, to sort of introduce some intentional negative feedbacks to keep the system from running away like that. But it doesn't seem to be working, because the goal, as Frank Rotering rightly points out, is not human well-being. The goal is profits, and profits, I think many laissez-faire capitalists would argue, are a perfect proxy for human well-being, something that can be quantified and pursued objectively. But I disagree. And I think you have pointed out in your interview with the gentleman who wrote the book on grain elevators, what was that book? Or who was his name?
His name is Bill Brown, and his book was American Colossus. That was the name of the book. But yeah, he had written he's a zine publisher and an author of that book.
Well, he had pointed out this possibility of workers' councils, and you said something that really moved me, and it was something to the effect of, sure, there's workers' councils, but so many people in this system are doing utterly absurd jobs which shouldn't even exist. And I think you and I both probably occupy those jobs. And there's no point in organizing, our jobs so that they are done in a way that we think is intelligent or, adaptable or somehow worth doing. The jobs themselves aren't worth doing. The products that they promote aren't worth doing. It just seems that so much of what our capitalist system has us doing is pursuing economic activity for its own sake, which consumes resources that could be better used in other ways or better left unused. And, we have to do it because we have to make enough money to survive economically. But so much of that money and so much of that economic activity that we have to engage in to, quote, survive is not really necessary for our survival. And I think if we can get enough people to realize that and accept that, then I think things will change of their own accord in a very positive way. But it's an uphill battle, because there is what Joe Bagent calls the hologram in full effect, which is the media saturation, which is controlled by corporations and which serves corporate interests, and which keeps us all hypnotized and focused on, just trivial garbage.
I am stuck in a machine, and I doubt that I ever will get out of this machine. Turning from orange to green, turning from orange to green. Please let me out, please let me out of this machine.
Well, last night and today I've been working on this podcast that's not going to have any interview on it, even though I have a backlog of interviews that I could put up, because I, somewhat at your direction, but on my own as well, try to respond to other people's podcasts as a part of my podcast. And lately I've been a little bit troubled by some of the things I've been hearing on other podcasts, and or at least feel like I need to introduce some sort of response that's a little bit more sustained than just a little collage at the end of my show can manage. I feel like this self-help approach, alongside of a conspiracy-minded approach to the world's problems, can really lead to disturbingly reactionary positions in people. That this tendency to view the world through the prism of basically a conspiracy theory version of history, where everything we know is wrong, and if we just are enlightened as individuals, we could go back to the way the world's supposed to work, and with just the Rothschilds and these other bad agents that have caused the problem. This is a position I think a lot of people end up with when they don't take a more social view. Is that one of your problems with conspiracy theories as well? I mean, I know you've been kind of reluctant to go down that road. Is that one of the reasons why?
It just puts me in a bad headspace. I've made a dangerous discovery recently. Typically, I will listen to one Alex Jones program a month. And part of that is a conscious decision to limit the amount of Alex Jones material that comes into my consciousness. And part of it is just the fact that, for me to download his show as a podcast, it's a big file, and I don't have internet access at home, so I have to make a deliberate effort to get to the library and carve out enough time to download that podcast and transfer it over to my phone, which is also my MP3 player. But I've recently discovered that I can just dial a number and tune in to Alex Jones' live stream, and I don't have to download it. I can just stream it over the airwaves through my phone. And I listened to Alex on the way to work, I think 3 days last week. And I really struggle with it because, right now, and, I know you like to keep these interviews, you age them more than I do. But right now, and this is first week of October, Alex is up in arms about a private prison facility that is in Montana, and there's a town in Montana that is now being policed by a private police force, which is composed of foreign mercenaries who call themselves, I think, the Police Force of America or something like that. It's a private corporation, but they have put decals on their Mercedes SUVs that they drive around as their police vehicles that say Hardin City Police. Hardin is the name of this town. And there's a facility being built there, which has been built and is being expanded, which might be one of these so-called FEMA camps, the internment camps for the internally displaced that the government expects to have to deal with in the not-too-distant future. And it's also being called Guantanamo West. And if everything that he says is true, if a fraction of what he says is true, we really should be paying attention to it. But at the same time, at the same time, if you listen to the 20 hours worth of material that Alex Jones puts out every week, you're going to go crazy. You're going to be a nut job. You're going to be a fanatic who's living in a fantasy world that, might be informed by a few factual elements, but, to characterize the entire world according to the evil machinations of a select few that Alex Jones points out, it has you living in a dystopian fantasy world. All dystopian fantasy worlds have little elements taken from the real world, to give them plausibility and make them a convincing virtual environment. But it is a virtual environment nonetheless, and it's one that I'd choose not to live in. And when I find myself listening to Alex Jones, 3 days a week on my drive to work, I know that I've slipped into a bad habit. It's something that I need to put right.
Yeah, I listen to him, or used to listen to him as well. The thing about Alex Jones that is, as someone who commutes a long way, the thing that's compelling about him is he does a long show, and it's always interesting. And so even if you find yourself outraged by some of what he's saying, you can be assured that you got 4 hours of material there, or 3 hours of material there that will keep you engaged. And if you have a long commute, that's worth, that's why you keep listening.
And what's more, I agree with his core message. When you strip out the ranting against conspiracists and, the New World Order and whatnot, like, have you seen the movie Waking Life? The animated? Yeah. So Alex Jones has got a bit in that. He's the one driving around in the car with the PA system on top, just ranting into a microphone at nobody. And his message there is spot on. I love it. I support it 100%. And then the same filmmaker, Richard Linklater, he adapted a Philip K. Dick novel, A Scanner Darkly, and he used that same, nouveau rotoscoping technique. And Alex Jones is in that as well, and he's standing on a street corner with a megaphone, which is the real Alex Jones does, and he's shouting about the evils of the drug war and how, we're spending all this money and sacrificing all these freedoms, and these so-called, the problems that are supposedly caused by drug use are worse than ever. And we can't acknowledge that, the problems that are associated with drug use are exacerbated by prohibition. And as he's ranting this at nobody in particular, because nobody is listening as he stands on the street corner with his megaphone, a black van pulls up and guys get out and they taser him and they throw him in the van and they drive away. Yeah, so, I'm not a critic of Alex Jones.
See, I am a critic of Alex Jones, even though I completely agree with everything he said in Waking Life and everything he said in the Scanner Darkly, and that I appreciate a lot of what he does, and I even believe in some of the same conspiracy theories that he believes in. My problem with Alex Jones is that he is a paleoconservative, and not looking at structural problems. He doesn't have a structural approach. He has a conspiracy approach. He believes that there are bad actors that have an agenda, and there are bad actors that have an agenda, but their agenda is shaped by the structure of society, and he is not one to really speak to how to change the structure of society, and I think the reason why is that at base he doesn't think it should be changed. He just thinks we need to get rid of the bad apples. So I have a problem with that. I also think that he has that. I think we're at a point right now in this crisis where we could be led to a response that's a fascist response. The public could be led through a legitimate desire for change and a legitimate realization of the corruption of the present system into a fascist reaction, and you see it right now. It's happening. The response to Obama is a fascist response. The only protest out there is from the far right, and worse than being far right, it's the incoherent right. And that's a large part of what fascism relies on is irrationality. And I'm really concerned because I don't feel that there's any living left progressive tradition in this country anymore. The best voices we have against the current system are people like Alex Jones, and he's at heart a reactionary. So I am a critic of him, and I think that that's why I'm doing this podcast today, is to say, look, if you aren't concerned with the core of what you're going at, if you're listening to the surface of this, you can be led astray. Guys like Eustace Mullins, who was on the Gnostic Media podcast, he probably sounds pretty cool to a lot of people who have very progressive concerns about, say, the current banking situation. But his message is truly a fascist one. And you have to be aware of what the underlying agenda is for critics as well as the people who are in power.
I can respond by saying when it comes to conservatives, I'm a lot more favorably disposed to paleo-conservatives than neoconservatives.
Well, sure.
I certainly, I'm very sympathetic to people who, I think like Alex Jones, like to point to, the Constitution of the United States to say, look, this huge federal apparatus which is invading every aspect of life is not authorized by the Constitution. The Constitution enumerates a very short list of specific duties and powers that are given to the federal government, and everything else is reserved for the states and for the people. And I think that liberals, particularly elitist, world-saving liberals, are very antagonistic to that message, and I don't support them in that antagonism. And I don't think that's where you're coming from. But I do get the impression, you say that the only opposition to power now seems to be from the sort of lunatic right. And I think it's because a lot of people have bought into this idea that you can just vote for the right guy, put the right guy behind the controls of power, and he'll do the right thing. And, we've got our first black president. We've got this articulate, dynamic, really impassioned, soulful person in the position of power. So now everything's fine, and we can go back to, celebrity gossip and sports or whatever, or saving the rainforest, or feeding hungry children, and not have to worry because, our team is in control now, and so things are going to get better. Right now we're sort of writing out the repercussions of the bad actor behind the seat of, behind the controls for 8 years. But once, those lingering effects have sort of faded away, then the nobility and the justice inherent in our savior, Barack Obama, will just naturally shape the society, and that's nonsense. The structures of power, as you say, are the problem. And Alex Jones, I think, is a pretty good advocate for taking apart those creeping sort of kid glove totalitarianism that we really do seem to be facing.
Oh yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I listen to him. It's not like every part of his message is something that I disagree with. The thing that's troubling to me most of all is that it's guys like Alex Jones who I feel that are reactionaries, really at base, are the only ones who are still looking at the overall problem as something that needs to be fixed. The left has just kind of gone to sleep, and maybe it was never awake. But the one thing I'll say for guys like Alex Jones or Eustace Mullins or any of these people on the right is that they're looking at the need for radical, by the root change. People are going to waking up to the fact that there's a need for radical change. We have some choices. One of the real easy choices is whether we're going to go into, and the right-left paradigm may not be the right way to view this, but whether we're going to go into a direction where control and power is more centralized, or whether we're going to try to spread that power out amongst people equitably. And while Alex Jones does not advocate outright any kind of centralized authority, his position, which is essentially pro-capitalist, I think leaves in place the mechanisms of power that lead to highly centralized mechanisms of control. And that's what populist fascism does, is it takes legitimate concerns and flips it into something that the elite can use, the structure that as the capitalist corporate structure can use. And you can see it happening on the streets right now in the healthcare debate. These are people who are really getting screwed, who are out there protesting against Obama's plan, and they ought to be out there protesting against Obama's plan because it's going to screw them more. But they don't know why they're protesting, and they're being led by the pharmaceutical and health insurance industry. They're totally, to the extent that they're not actually phonies, they're actually being completely manipulated by the very corporate structure that's screwing them and making the backroom deals with the Obama administration to make sure that they're going to continue to be screwed. So anyway, I should do my own Alex Jones show instead of this Diet Soap podcast. I should get up and rant. That would be, I don't know if I could sustain it for 4 hours. I think I would go crazy. But
yeah. See, that's the thing with Alex Jones. He produces so much material that he has to repeat a lot, and he has to basically just shout and re-emphasize and fill the space. He has to expand what he's focusing on to fill the amount of space he's committed himself to filling every week. And he doesn't really control who his message appeals to, but the audience that he attracts does feed back into the message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and who do you think that audience is? I mean, it's obviously you and I are part of that audience.
Mm-hmm. Not as a regular audience member. It's like what Neil Kramer said something about David Icke, in that, David Icke, if you internalize the message that he's putting out, you will be liberated to some degree, and that David Icke is providing a service in that respect. But people who obsess over David Icke and are David Icke followers are probably in a very maladaptive headspace. They're probably very paranoid and not in a good state of mind most of the time. And I seem to feel the same way about Alex Jones, in that I like so much of what he stands for, so much of what he advocates, so much of what he does, in fact, and at the same time, for it to fill that much of one's consciousness that completely, it's going to have a very distorting effect. And yeah, I think the people that it appeals to are people who have a strong sense of dissatisfaction with the world. They don't really have any clearly articulated idea of what it is they don't like, but they know they don't like something. And they know they don't like the sort of effete liberal criticisms that get thrown around of the way things are now. And what Alex Jones seems to resonate with them, he's a strong Second Amendment guy, and there's, I think Joe Bagent really got this right. The left really, really screws the pooch when they try to go after people's guns, because they have no chance whatsoever of disarming the American populace. And at the same time, they really antagonize people who have grown up with guns and see guns as just part of how a right American lives. So I think Alex Jones has really scored big in championing the Second Amendment.
Right. And, the thing about it that I agree with there is that, the mainstream left, as such as it exists, if you want to call it that in this country, has about as much respect for everyday people as the mainstream right. And I will say
this,
which
is to say
Alex
none.
Jones. Right, none at all. And I will say this for Alex Jones: I don't think he's like Andy Griffith in that movie. I forget the name of it now, but where he, when he goes off the air, that down home persona goes away and he starts talking trash about his audience. I don't think he's like that. I think he does respect everyday people. That he really is an actual populist in that regard. Yeah, but there's a tendency. You talk to a kind of a mainstream liberal, a Democrat, just Kool-Aid drinking Democrat. I'm going to talk as much like Alex Jones as I can, and they don't trust. If I talk about like revolutionary change, where more people are participating in the system and everybody gets a chance to have a role, one of the things I'll hear is, how can you trust these people? To do the right thing? Most people are such idiots. They're all, this country is full of backwards, reactionary, right-wing Republicans. I don't want them in charge. And it's like, wow, these are your neighbors. If people are working together as neighbors, suddenly the right-left thing and these, that's not where it's at.
That leads me to the whole, size of human interaction and community topic, but we definitely don't have time to get into that. We've actually, I'll be interested to see which portions of this conversation actually get into the podcast.
Whenever you are tired of your lot
and you're craving for the things you haven't got. Whenever you feel claustrophobic in your little box, and you gaze down at the water where it's clashing with the rocks. Whenever you become fed up with what the fates are dealing, just remember that the sky is not a ceiling. Whenever you are sick of earthly things, and you feel like shedding all your limbs and growing feathered wings. Whenever you are standing and you wish that you could fly, when you would give up supper for a small piece of the pie. When your insides feel like breaking out and your outsides feel like peeling, just remember that the sky is not a ceiling. Whenever you are climbing up a tree, and the sun at the horizon is as far as you can see. Whenever you grow weary at the prospect of old age, and you think of Charles Ives and his leopard in the cage. When your body takes the bait and your mind starts in a reeling, just remember that the sky is not a ceiling. Whenever you are tired of the past, and you can't make it to the future, but you watch the simulcast. Whenever you are weary of this godforsaken place, and you want to take a rocket and go into outer space. When you feel like you are lost at sea and drowning in the feeling, just remember that the sky is not a ceiling. Remember that the sky is not a ceiling.
I wonder if you're familiar with the Diet Soap podcast.
No, I'm not. Tell me about it.
Well, it is a podcast which was in part inspired by the Sea-Rome podcast. And the host, Doug Lane, he says that he thinks of his podcast as part of an ongoing conversation that takes place in a public space between the various podcasters. And he frequently puts together montages from different podcasts to sort of show how there are certain themes that are circulating through all of them, even though, we're not necessarily doing it deliberately or consciously.
Well, that's really fascinating. What's it called again?
Diet Soap.
Cosmic horror. The idea that life is incomprehensible to human minds and that the universe is fundamentally alien.
The LSD experience was not a good one. The landlord tried to get into the apartment and scared the shit out of me, and I remember just kind of feeling more tense than I ever had in my life, like my whole body was just about to go off like a rocket. And
got to think about every possible way to make getting through this crisis tolerable.
The first time that I really went out with DMT, and I really didn't want to do it.
To actually complete a human cycle of existence, you have to go into death. It's where you came from, in some sense. I mean, we put a lot of attention into death. We don't look very much at birth. We think we understand it. I mean, we all know the story about the sperm and the egg and all that. But before that, what is going on?
Those who genuinely reason gamble with sanity.
All clarity is achieved by the sacrifice of true identity.
Where from a certain perspective, from a certain scientific materialist perspective, if you look at human life too critically, too closely, too materialistically, that all of your illusions will not stand up. Your illusions will not stand up. You will see too much. You will see that in your love is the stirrings of meaningless DNA. You will see that in your hopes is the sort of delusions that your psychology injects to keep you motivated.
In my highest state, I have had the insight, which I will convey to you without saying it's true, that this is the most limited form of existence you will ever know. You can't be deader than this.
There being cracks in the universe beyond which exist realities and entities who are waiting to figure out how to connect with us or contact us.
Cosmic horror. The idea that life is incomprehensible to human minds and that the universe is fundamentally alien.
That just about wraps up the 30th episode of the Diet Soap Podcast. But before we go, there's a bit of business left. Quite a bit. For one thing, I want to thank the sponsors of this week's episode. Terry I, a regular listener and regular correspondent, donated this last week, and I was just as glad to hear from Terry as I was to receive the PayPal donation. Oliver also donated and sent me an email through Facebook. That's right, I have a Facebook account. I'm the Douglas Lane in Portland, Oregon, and I have an email address. That's douglane@dietsoap.org. Lane is spelled L-A-I-N. And now, I have a Skype voicemail number. So please call in and say a little something. You're sure to hear it on the podcast. If you do, that number is 971-285-4604. That's 971-285-4604. That's my voicemail number, and if you leave a message, I'll try to integrate it into an upcoming episode. I also received an email from RG this week, and I appreciated that as well. This anonymous soul reminded me that in episode 28, I used some music for the collage bit that I never identified. That was the theme to the French film Diva, circa 1981, and I highly recommend that movie. So, again, in episode 28, entitled Better Bad News, I used the theme from Diva. This week's collage conversation between the podcasts that are out there, that I listen to, featured the stylings of Felonious Monk's In Walked Bud, along with clips from the Sea Realm, Gordy Theorems, the Psychedelic Salon, Bill Moyer's Journal, and others. And that was Terence McKenna you heard talking. His voice wasn't as clear as the others, and I apologize about that, but it was an old recording. There were also songs from Chris Isto White this week, of course, including a cover of Young at Heart and some original songs, the Clockwork Isto song and The Sky Is Not a Ceiling. If you like Isto as much as I do, you will want to check out his website. That's lumberjackisto.com. That's the word lumberjack and the letters ISTO.com. I recently used some of the money donated to the podcast to purchase one of Isto's albums, so we'll be hearing more from him in the future. He's a musician and artist well worth supporting, I think. So there's one last thing. A few weeks ago, after the Skeleton Key episode, I received an email from KMO asking me to clarify my objections to Eustace Mullins and the Gnostic Media podcast that featured an interview with him, with Eustace. Why did I discount Eustace Mullins and his information about the Federal Reserve? Well, what I discount is Mullins' interpretation of the facts, and I do this without having verified all the facts he's presented. So I don't accept all the facts he presents. At base, I just know that the problems we face aren't brought on by a Jewish conspiracy, and that's what Mullins is ultimately suggesting. I hope to have a conversation, though, with Jan Irvin, the host of the Gnostic Media podcast. A conversation about Mullins, the conspiracy theory of history, and the need to reject fascist or conspiracy theory versions of history. So hopefully I'll get a chance to really respond and flesh out my position, which I admit isn't as clear as I'd like right now. There are real conspiracies, so that makes it complicated, but I think these conspiracies occur within a capitalist logic, and it's that capitalist logic that needs to be dismantled, and rather than the Jewish race. So anyway, so that just about wraps up this episode. All we have left is my lovely wife Miriam and her Titanic factoid. So I'll turn it over to her.
Following the loss of the Titanic in April 1912, there was quite a lot of discourse regarding the reasons for the sinking, the heroism of all of the players, you know, the people aboard the Titanic and the lifeboats. Much analysis of the sea rule, women and children first, both by suffragists and many others, and also the gap between the rich and the poor on board. In an article called The Titanic Tragedy from a socialist newspaper called The Appeal to Reason, published May 4th, 1912, it's written, "There are 1,000 reasons why this horror upon the high sea should never have occurred, why it was absolutely inexcusable and indefensible, why it was courted and inevitable, and why, in fact, it will prove in the lapse of time to have been a blessing to humanity." Along with the large number of immigrants traveling in steerage, the Titanic was remarkable for its luxury, of course, and the many famous and wealthy passengers. There were people like Isidore and Ida Strauss, who were the owners of Macy's, the founders of Macy's, Benjamin Guggenheim, who it is said put on his very best jacket along with his valet and said, "We are dressed in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen." Lucille Duff Gordon, who was a famous dress designer who actually did survive, and particularly John Jacob Astor, who was the wealthiest man aboard the ship. He did die. He went down with the ship while his 19-year-old pregnant new bride, Madeline, survived aboard a lifeboat. So, thinking about this same article goes on to say later, John Jacob Astor went down with the stokers in the hold. In the flash of an instant, they were on a level. Death equalized them, established their kinship, made them brothers. In life, capitalism separated them as widely as the poles, but at the supreme moment, and in the presence of the infinite, they were united and stood on one common basis of equality in the democracy of death.